Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The arrogance of power. Tom Evans, CEO of a multi-million-dollar logistics company, was used to getting what he wanted, and everyone around him knew it. He didn't have time for pleasantries, trivial interactions, or any distractions. Success had been his sole focus for the last decade, and he had built his empire from the ground up. His world was filled with boardroom meetings, high-stakes negotiations, and endless piles of paperwork that only he could decipher. Today, as he boarded his first-class flight from Orlando to Chicago, he was surrounded by luxury that he believed was his due. The luxury lounge at Orlando International Airport was silent except for the occasional murmur of business travelers discussing quarterly reports or corporate strategies. Tom had long since tuned out the noise. He drummed his fingers impatiently on the sleek leather armrest of the chair as he scrolled through endless business emails. His eyes narrowed as he read yet another message from his warehouse manager, apologizing for a delayed shipment. Ridiculous, he muttered under his breath, typing out a curt reply to demand an explanation. His company was known for efficiency, and anything less than perfection was unacceptable. As Tom's flight was called, he gathered his designer briefcase and pushed himself out of his seat, his mind still focused on the emails he had yet to address. He walked briskly towards the gate, barely noticing the young woman who scanned his boarding pass. Time, in his world, was money, and he had no interest in wasting it on meaningless interactions. Tom's thoughts were interrupted only when he stepped onto the aircraft. The first-class cabin was spacious and comfortable, and he was glad to settle into his seat, 2A, nestled by the window. As he arranged his briefcase and other belongings, his eyes wandered briefly over the flight attendants. One in particular caught his attention, Sasha. Tall, poised, and with an air of quiet confidence, she moved through the aisle with practiced ease. Tom noted her professionalism, but there was something about her that irritated him. She had an undeniable presence, yet he couldn't quite put his finger on why she bothered him. She greeted him with a polite, "Welcome aboard, sir," as he passed by, her warm smile barely touching the edges of his consciousness. Tom gave her a curt nod, dismissing her as he made his way to his seat. He pulled out his phone and went back to his emails, already ignoring her and the rest of the cabin. He didn't need to think about anyone else. As the flight took off, Tom remained absorbed in his work. The low hum of the engine and the soft clink of the flight attendants moving up and down the aisles seemed like background noise to him. He couldn't afford to focus on anything else. The company, the numbers, and the market were always on his mind. A sharp beep from the overhead call button cut through his thoughts. His eyes flicked to the illuminated button next to his seat. He pressed it, not bothering to check who was on the other end. Sasha arrived at his side within moments, her movements smooth and controlled. "How may I assist you, sir?" "I need the strongest coffee you've got," Tom said curtly, not looking up from his phone. "And make it quick. Some of us have actual work to do." Sasha's voice remained calm and professional. "Of course, sir. I'll bring that right away." She turned and moved away without a hint of annoyance, despite the clear disrespect in Tom's tone. He watched her walk off, her movements precise. Something about her confidence stirred an uncomfortable feeling inside him, but he quickly pushed it aside, returning to his emails. When Sasha returned with his coffee, Tom took a sip and immediately grimaced. It wasn't hot enough for his taste. "This is barely warm," he muttered, more to himself than to her, but his voice was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I suppose I shouldn't expect much from someone who probably learned to make coffee at some fast food joint." Sasha's face tightened for a split second, but she didn't flinch. She stood there, silent and composed. "I apologize if the temperature isn't to your liking, sir. I'd be happy to bring you a fresh cup." Tom waved his hand dismissively. "Don't bother," he sneered. "I'm sure it'll be just as disappointing as your people usually are." There it was, the venom in his words. The casual racism, the elitism, the sense of superiority he felt so comfortable wielding. Sasha's body tensed. She had heard comments like this before, but it didn't make them any easier to bear. Yet, her training kicked in. She knew her role, knew how to keep calm and professional, no matter the provocation. The surrounding passengers could feel the tension thickening in the air. Some turned away, pretending not to notice, but others couldn't help but glance nervously at Sasha, unsure if they should step in or stay silent. The rest of the cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to pass. Sasha, despite the stinging words, remained silent. She simply nodded and walked away, trying to steady her racing heartbeat. Her mind was a whirl of thoughts, but she knew better than to react. The last thing she needed was to make the situation worse. But deep down, anger simmered. She had dealt with bigotry, prejudice, and disrespect throughout her life, but it never got easier. This man, Tom Evans, was a stark reminder of the divide that still existed, one that she had to navigate daily with grace. As she moved to the back of the plane to compose herself, Tom leaned back in his seat, smirking, oblivious to the impact of his words. He had made his point, and in his mind, he had put the flight attendant in her place. He picked up his coffee again, grimacing at its temperature, yet feeling a sense of superiority. This was his world, one where money and power ruled. But as the plane cruised through the sky, something was stirring beneath the surface. Tom Evans didn't know it yet, but the universe was about to teach him a lesson that would break down the walls of his arrogance and force him to confront everything he had ever taken for granted. And that lesson would come in a way he could never have predicted. The journey was only just beginning. The sudden shift. The next few hours of the flight passed in a blur. Tom's eyes remained glued to his phone as he responded to email after email, ignoring the occasional murmurs of fellow passengers and the rustle of flight attendants moving through the aisles. He was wrapped up in his own world, in his own sense of control, when an unexpected turn of events would soon shatter that illusion. Sasha moved through the cabin with steady precision, serving drinks, making small talk, and keeping the passengers at ease. She had long learned how to silence the inner noise, to push her emotions aside when faced with disrespect. But that didn't mean it was easy. Every word from Tom still stung, each remark a reminder of the prejudice she fought against daily. Yet, Sasha had learned to stand strong, to push through the pain, and to not let others see her break. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, "You are more than what they say you are. Don't let their words define you." But it wasn't just Tom's comments that were weighing on her heart. It was the years of encounters like this one, the quiet microaggressions that came in subtle forms, the tone of a customer's voice, the dismissive glances, the way her competence was often questioned because of her race or gender. But she wasn't here to make waves. She was here to work, to do her job, and to get through the day with as much dignity as she could muster. However, as she moved down the aisle once more, there was a shift in the air. A tension, palpable and thick, began to ripple through the cabin. It wasn't just the usual discomfort from Tom's rude behavior. Something more visceral had begun to stir. It began with a strange sound. A low, almost imperceptible noise, like a sharp intake of breath that quickly turned into a gasp. Sasha paused mid-step, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the cabin. Tom had his hand clutching his throat, his face suddenly contorted in pain. His phone had fallen to the floor, forgotten. He seemed to be gasping for air, his breathing ragged, erratic. The color drained from his face, and his eyes widened with panic. "Sir?" Sasha asked, stepping forward with the instinctive rush of concern, though her heart began to beat faster. "What's happening to him?" Tom's eyes met hers, but there was no sign of recognition. Just terror. He reached for the armrest with trembling fingers, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to inhale. His chest rose and fell erratically, his breath coming in desperate, shallow bursts. His face was a grotesque shade of red, his lips beginning to darken. It was clear something was terribly wrong, and the haughty man who had just moments ago belittled her was now utterly vulnerable. "Help, please, help me," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper, yet tinged with a desperation that sent a shiver down Sasha's spine. Sasha's training kicked in, her professional instincts overtaking her shock. She reached for the emergency medical kit stored near the galley, her hands moving swiftly and efficiently despite the chaos surging through her mind. Her thoughts raced as she rushed back toward him. What is happening? Is he choking? Does he need CPR? The other passengers were beginning to stir, some looking around in confusion, others frozen in fear. One woman shouted for a doctor, while a man across the aisle fumbled to open the emergency oxygen mask compartment. The flight attendants, trained to handle medical emergencies, rushed to assist, but there was a clear sense of urgency. This was not a simple case of someone fainting or having a minor issue. This was something much more severe. Sasha arrived at Tom's side, kneeling next to him. His face was an alarming shade of purple now, his eyes bulging with panic. His breathing had become more labored, and his hands gripped the seat armrest in a vice-like grip, his fingers barely able to hold on. He was teetering on the edge, and in that moment, Sasha knew it. He might not make it. Tom, she called out, trying to get his attention, but his eyes fluttered. His chest jerked with each labored breath, but it seemed to get harder and harder for him to breathe. He could no longer speak, and the terror in his eyes was all Sasha needed to see to know he was in danger. His earlier cruelty, the arrogant comments, the insults, they all seemed irrelevant now. He was just a man, a human being in need of help, and that was all that mattered. In this moment, all of his wealth, power, and privilege meant nothing. The world he had built, his empire, was crumbling before his eyes. Sasha's hands moved quickly as she assessed his condition, asking the other flight attendants to grab the oxygen mask and any other necessary equipment. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't hesitate. In her mind, the words of her mother echoed once more, "You are stronger than you think. Don't let fear stop you." For the first time, Tom was not the one holding the power. He was vulnerable. And Sasha, despite everything he had said, despite how he had tried to tear her down, was now his only hope. "Just breathe," she muttered, her voice calm, despite the rising panic inside her. "I've got you. You're going to be okay." Her words sounded hollow to her own ears, but she knew she had to stay strong. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about doing what needed to be done to save his life, no matter how much she wanted to walk away, to leave him to suffer the consequences of his actions. This was no longer about his cruel words or the way he had tried to humiliate her. It was about the life that hung in the balance. The minutes stretched on as the flight attendants worked together, stabilizing Tom as much as possible while others in the cabin anxiously whispered, watching helplessly. Sasha's hands worked tirelessly, connecting the oxygen mask to Tom's face, keeping him conscious as best she could. When she looked into his eyes once more, they were filled with the stark realization of his mortality. There was no arrogance left, no superiority. There was just a man who had spent years in a world of power, and now, for the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be vulnerable. "Please," Tom's voice cracked. "I was wrong. Sasha didn't say anything. She simply kept working, her focus unwavering. The plane was still miles away from landing, but the passengers had now become spectators to something much more profound than just a flight. What had started as a long journey toward a business meeting had turned into a battle for survival. And somewhere, in the midst of the chaos, a quiet shift began to take place within Tom. It was a shift he would never forget. A shift that would change the trajectory of his life forever. The harsh reality. As the flight continued on its course, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted. The tension that had once been sparked by Tom's cruel words and attitude now hung heavy in the air, but for an entirely different reason. The passengers, who had once been silently observing the drama unfold, now sat in collective silence, unsure of what to do or how to react to the shocking turn of events. Tom Evans, the powerful businessman who had once held everyone in contempt, was now gasping for life, dependent on the woman he had just moments ago humiliated. Sasha stayed by his side, her focus never wavering. She continued to monitor his vitals, adjusting the oxygen mask to ensure that he was getting the air he so desperately needed. Her hands were steady, but the tightness in her chest grew with each passing minute. She couldn't afford to think about the emotions swirling inside her. The years of mistreatment, the insults, the struggles, all of it had to be pushed aside. Right now, it was just about saving this man's life, no matter how he had treated her or others like her. Just breathe, Mr. Evans. Stay with me, Sasha murmured, her voice calm but firm as she adjusted the equipment. Tom's eyes were wide, panic still evident in his gaze. His earlier arrogance and dismissal of her had completely evaporated. Now, there was only fear. Fear that he might not make it. Fear that all the wealth and power he had amassed could not protect him from the cruel reality that life could be lost in an instant. I didn't mean it, he whispered, his voice shaking with desperation. I didn't mean what I said. Please, please help me. Sasha didn't respond. The apology, the desperation, felt empty. She could feel the weight of the years of frustration bearing down on her, the years of being overlooked, underestimated, and belittled. But she had learned that people like Tom only apologized when they were on the brink of losing something they couldn't replace. It wasn't real, it was just fear talking. Sasha knew better than to let herself be swayed by empty words. The thought of walking away from him, leaving him to suffer the consequences of his actions, flickered briefly in her mind. The urge to turn her back on him, to let him face the same disregard he had shown her, was powerful. But deep down, she knew that wasn't who she was. Sasha was a professional, and in that moment, she was a life-saving force. She couldn't afford to let his past behavior dictate her actions. The man before her, struggling to breathe, was someone entirely different than the arrogant, entitled figure who had mocked her just hours earlier. Her hands moved quickly but carefully, checking his pulse, ensuring the oxygen flow was stable. The minutes felt like hours. Other flight attendants worked alongside her, passing equipment, taking turns to administer medical assistance, and offering any support they could. Meanwhile, Sasha remained rooted to his side, watching over him with the intensity of someone who had been through far more than any of them knew. The panic in Tom's eyes began to ebb ever so slightly as his breathing steadied, though he was still far from being out of danger. His chest rose and fell with less effort now, though it was still a struggle for him to regain control over his body. His once slicked-back hair was now tousled with sweat, his suit wrinkled and disheveled. The polished exterior he had worn so confidently was now shattered. A thought began to stir in his mind, one he had never truly entertained before: humility. It was a foreign concept to him, something he had always dismissed as weakness. Growing up, Tom had been taught to take what he wanted, to demand more, to never show any sign of vulnerability. It was a lesson ingrained in him throughout his rise to power. But now, as he lay there, struggling to catch his breath, he saw the world through a different lens. The wealth, the status, the power, none of it mattered. It wasn't the numbers on his bank statement or the luxury of his homes that would save him now. No, it was the kindness of a woman he had insulted, humiliated, and degraded. She was his lifeline, and she was the one who could choose whether or not to save him. She was the one who could choose to help him or to let him go. And that choice, her choice, was his reckoning. Tom turned his head slightly, meeting Sasha's gaze. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. It wasn't the same arrogant look he had given her earlier. No, this was different. This was a man who had just realized how fragile life truly was, how easily it could be ripped away, how quickly everything he had taken for granted could slip through his fingers. The words that left his mouth this time were genuine, spoken from a place of raw vulnerability. "I'm sorry," he rasped. "I didn't know. I didn't understand. I was wrong." Sasha's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let her guard down. Apologies came easy when life was on the line, and she had heard many empty ones in her career. Still, the apology wasn't what mattered. What mattered was how he would change after this, how this moment would reshape his understanding of power, respect, and human connection. Would he go back to being the man who thought his money and status could shield him from reality? Or would this moment mark the beginning of something deeper? She nodded slightly, but her expression remained professional, neutral. "Focus on breathing." Don't worry about anything else right now. You need to rest. Her words were firm, not an invitation to further conversation, but rather a directive to keep him grounded in the present, to keep him fighting for survival. Tom's breathing had calmed slightly, but he still appeared weak, vulnerable. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to rest for a moment, though his mind raced. Sasha felt a strange mix of emotions as she watched him. There was a deep sense of satisfaction that, despite everything he had done, she had not given up on him. And yet, there was something unsettling about it as well. She didn't want him to leave this experience unchanged. She wanted him to understand that his arrogance had consequences, that the way he had treated people, especially people like her, was not something that could be easily erased. But in the back of her mind, she knew that if he survived this, if he made it through this ordeal, it could be a moment of redemption for him. The rest of the flight continued, the minutes dragging on as Sasha and the other attendants worked to stabilize Tom further. By the time the plane began its descent into Chicago, Tom's condition had stabilized enough to ensure he was no longer in immediate danger. But the emotional toll of what had just happened would follow him long after the plane landed. When the aircraft touched down, and the passengers began to disembark, many gave Tom curious, wary looks. His transformation had not gone unnoticed. But it was Sasha who caught his eye as he slowly stood from his seat. He looked different, smaller somehow, as though the weight of his arrogance had been lifted, and in its place was a man trying to make sense of a world that had just pulled him down from his pedestal. He stopped before Sasha, the words on his lips now much more humble than they had been when he first boarded the plane. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice shaky. I won't forget this." Sasha looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, without a word, she nodded and stepped aside, allowing him to exit the plane. But as she watched him walk away, she couldn't help but wonder, would he remember this lesson when the next challenge came, or would his arrogance return in time? Only time would tell. For now, all she could do was hope that this experience would be the turning point he so desperately needed. Redemption and reflection. Weeks passed since that harrowing flight. The memory of the event still lingered in Sasha's mind. Each time she closed her eyes, she could recall the fear and vulnerability that had filled Tom's eyes, the way his arrogance had shattered in an instant, replaced by raw desperation. It was a moment that had changed him, at least, it seemed that way. But deep down, Sasha knew the true test would come not in that moment of crisis, but in how he would respond in the days, months, and years that followed. Tom Evans, the once towering figure of power, had vanished in a way. The man who had once strutted through the world with the belief that his wealth and position made him untouchable, that he could push people aside without consequence, was now a man transformed. Sasha had heard from a few of the flight's passengers, strangers to him, who had witnessed his humbling in real time, that Tom had indeed followed through on his apology. In fact, one passenger reported that after the flight, Tom made a heartfelt donation to a charity for underprivileged youth, something he'd never done before. But was it enough? Was it real? Sasha didn't have the answers. She simply kept doing her job, moving through life with the same professionalism and grace she always had, though a small part of her found herself wondering if Tom's change was genuine or just a fleeting reaction to his near-death experience. Meanwhile, Tom Evans' life outside the plane was in turmoil, though in a way, it was a turmoil of his own making. The night after the flight, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. For years, his life had been dictated by the constant chase for more money, more influence, more power. He had always believed that the world worked on a simple equation: those who had the most, got the most. That was how the game was played, and that was how he played it. But now, everything felt different. Every achievement, every victory, seemed hollow. The question that haunted him was simple: who had he become? The arrogance, the entitlement, the constant need to prove himself, it had all been a defense mechanism, a way to shield himself from the insecurities and fears that lay beneath the surface. But that day, when he had been helpless and gasping for air, all of those defenses had crumbled. He had seen himself for what he truly was, a man who had allowed his power and wealth to dictate his humanity, someone who had hurt others in his blind pursuit of success. And in that vulnerable moment, with Sasha standing over him, his world had cracked open. Tom's transformation wasn't immediate. It wasn't a one-time event, and he knew that. Change never worked that way. But he had made a decision to finally confront the demons of his past and start repairing the damage he had done, not only to himself but to the world around him. He began by reaching out to Sasha. Not through email or text, but with a handwritten letter, something rare in the age of digital communication. It was his first attempt at taking full accountability for his actions. The letter was simple, but the words were carefully chosen, as sincere as he could make them. Dear Sasha, I know that an apology cannot undo the harm I caused you, nor can it erase the words I said. But I want to take this moment to say that I deeply regret my actions, and I am ashamed of the person I was on that flight. You were kind and professional when I was at my worst, and for that, I am grateful. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do hope that you can find it in your heart to understand that the person who treated you so poorly is not the man I want to be anymore. Since that day, I have taken steps to reflect on my behavior and to make amends for the damage I have caused in my life and in the lives of others. This letter is the first of many steps toward redemption. I hope that this small gesture can begin to show you that I am committed to changing, to growing, and to using my position for good moving forward. Thank you for your grace and professionalism. I will never forget the lesson you unknowingly taught me that day. Tom Evans. Sasha received the letter at her apartment, and as she read through it, she felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, it was clear that Tom was trying to make things right, he was attempting to take responsibility for his actions, and that in itself was a monumental first step. But on the other hand, she couldn't forget the hurtful things he had said, the way he had demeaned her, and how his words had reflected a deeper prejudice, one that hadn't just been aimed at her but at an entire group of people. She set the letter down and sat in silence for a long while, contemplating what it meant to forgive someone like Tom Evans. Forgiveness, she knew, was never about excusing the actions of others, it was about freeing oneself from the bitterness and hatred that could take root when wronged. But was she ready to forgive him? Could she trust that his apology was sincere? A few days later, Tom invited Sasha to meet for coffee, a simple request, but one that showed he was serious about starting a dialogue, about showing her who he was now, not who he had been. Sasha agreed, albeit cautiously. She had no expectations, no hopes that this would somehow undo the years of hurt. But she was willing to listen. When they met, Tom was a different man. The arrogance that once dripped from his every word was gone. Instead, there was a raw honesty in his eyes, a humility that was foreign to the person she had once known. They talked for hours, not just about what had happened on that flight, but about their lives, their struggles, their dreams. Tom spoke openly about the pressures of his past, the insecurities that had driven his cruel behavior, and the awakening he had experienced after nearly losing his life. Sasha listened, and for the first time, she saw him not as the man who had belittled her, but as a human being, flawed and broken, just like anyone else. He wasn't perfect, and she wasn't sure that he would ever be, but he was trying. And in that moment, Sasha realized that sometimes redemption didn't come in grand gestures, it came in small moments of change, of growth, of honesty. The meeting ended with no grand conclusions. There were no sweeping promises of friendship or instant forgiveness. But there was understanding, a recognition that both of them had changed in ways they couldn't have imagined. Sasha knew that she couldn't forget the past, but she also knew that she couldn't allow it to define her future, either. In the months that followed, Tom kept his word. He made tangible changes in his life. He took responsibility for his past mistakes, both publicly and privately, and started supporting causes that fought for racial justice and equality, issues he had once been blind to. It was a long road, one that would require constant self-reflection, but he was committed to walking it. For Sasha, the journey was different. She didn't need Tom to change for her to feel whole. She had already done the hard work of learning to love herself, of learning to stand tall and proud in the face of adversity. But she did acknowledge the shift in him, and for that, she was cautiously grateful. As for Tom, he never forgot the lesson he learned on that flight. The powerful, life-changing experience of being knocked off his pedestal and forced to rely on the person he had once belittled became the cornerstone of his personal transformation. He had learned that true power wasn't in what you could take from the world, but in what you could give back to it. And in the end, he realized that redemption wasn't just about asking for forgiveness, it was about proving through your actions that you were worthy of it. A path forward, healing and legacy. As time moved forward, both Sasha and Tom found themselves on separate journeys of self-discovery, but the impact of their shared experience continued to shape their lives in profound ways. What had begun as a moment of intense confrontation and vulnerability had blossomed into something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. Sasha's journey, empowerment through adversity. For Sasha, the aftermath of the incident was more than just a test of personal growth, it was a test of resilience. She had long been familiar with the struggles of being a Black woman in a world that often overlooked her, dismissed her, or tried to diminish her worth. As a flight attendant, she had spent years working in an environment where she was expected to blend into the background, to serve without question, and to smile no matter the personal toll. She had become accustomed to microaggressions, dismissive comments, and subtle racism, but it had never stung as deeply as when Tom had verbally attacked her in front of other passengers. The public nature of his attack, the utter lack of regard for her humanity, it was a wound that, for a time, felt impossible to heal. But Sasha was not a woman defined by others' actions. She had always known that she had power, though it was often hidden beneath layers of professional restraint and societal expectation. The incident with Tom had forced her to confront that power head-on. It had sparked something within her, an understanding that she had the right to stand tall, to assert her worth, and to demand respect, not just from others, but from herself. Instead of retreating into bitterness, Sasha began to channel her energy into something constructive. She joined community organizations focused on racial justice, using her voice and experience to advocate for those who were often silenced. She attended workshops on personal empowerment, on how to hold space for herself in a world that often tried to take up too much of it. And in her personal life, she worked on forgiving, not because others always deserved it, but because forgiveness was a tool that set her free. Sasha's transformation was slow and steady. She never rushed it, knowing that healing wasn't a process that could be dictated by timelines. She grew stronger in her belief that her worth wasn't defined by others' opinions of her, and she made it her mission to show the world, through her actions, her words, and her unwavering presence, that she was more than just a flight attendant. She was a force in her own right, a woman of dignity and strength, and her journey had only just begun. Tom's redemption, beyond the apology. Tom Evans, meanwhile, found himself on an equally profound but equally difficult journey. After his meeting with Sasha, he realized that the road to redemption was not a straight line. It wasn't simply about saying the right things or making a few charitable donations. True change required deeper introspection and sustained effort. It was about shedding the old version of himself, one that had been defined by arrogance, entitlement, and unchecked privilege, and embracing a version of himself that was grounded in humility, compassion, and understanding. Tom's transformation began with an internal shift, one that was neither dramatic nor instantaneous, but rather quiet and continuous. He sought out therapy, something he had always believed was for the weak, not for a man of his stature. In those sessions, he began to unravel the layers of his past, his upbringing in a wealthy but emotionally distant family, the constant pressure to prove his worth in a competitive world, and the deeply rooted insecurities that had fueled his need to dominate and belittle others. He realized that his behavior towards Sasha was a manifestation of his own self-loathing, his desperate attempt to control a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. But therapy was only the beginning. Tom knew that true growth wouldn't come from introspection alone, it had to be accompanied by action. So, he made it his mission to learn from his past mistakes and to make tangible changes in the world around him. He started by using his influence and resources to support causes that promoted diversity and equality. He donated generously to initiatives that provided scholarships and mentorship programs for underprivileged Black youth, specifically those pursuing careers in industries where they had been historically underrepresented. Tom also started speaking out publicly about his experiences, about the lessons he had learned, and the ways in which privilege had blinded him to the humanity of others. He gave talks at corporate seminars, addressing the importance of empathy in leadership and the destructive impact of unchecked privilege. His goal wasn't to seek praise, but to use his story as a cautionary tale, to show that transformation was possible for anyone, no matter how far they had fallen. The most powerful change came, however, in the way he treated others on a day-to-day basis. Tom no longer looked at people through the lens of their status, race, or job title. He began to see them as equals, as human beings deserving of respect and dignity. It was a shift that didn't go unnoticed, both in his personal life and in his business dealings. Colleagues, employees, and even competitors began to comment on the changes in him. They saw the man who had once ruled with an iron fist, the man who had cut others down to elevate himself, become someone who listened, who collaborated, and who sought to uplift others. Tom knew he would never fully erase the mistakes of his past, but he had made a conscious decision to be better. And as time passed, he began to see that redemption wasn't about reaching some distant ideal of perfection, it was about consistent effort, humility, and a willingness to make amends for the harm one had caused. A meeting of the changed, a new understanding. Years after the fateful flight, Sasha and Tom found themselves meeting again, though this time it was not in the sterile confines of an airplane cabin, but in the open air of a community event. Tom had been invited as a guest speaker for a fundraiser that Sasha was also attending, and when their paths crossed, there was no tension between them. No awkwardness. Just two people who had been forever changed by an experience they would never forget. Tom approached Sasha hesitantly, unsure of what to say, but she smiled warmly, offering her hand. It was a gesture of peace, of acknowledgement that the past was indeed the past. There was no need to rehash old wounds, no need to revisit the pain. They had both grown, and that was what mattered. "I've been following your work," Tom said softly. "I admire what you've done. How you've turned everything around. I hope you know I meant what I said." Sasha nodded. "I do, Tom. I do. And I've seen the changes in you. I'm proud of you." They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, surrounded by people who were celebrating the work they had both contributed to in different ways. For a moment, it felt like the world had opened up for them both. They had found peace, not in perfection, but in the understanding that people could change, that redemption was possible, no matter how far one had fallen. In that brief exchange, Sasha realized something profound. It wasn't just about what happened between her and Tom. It was about the ripple effect of their story. Tom's transformation wasn't only about him, his efforts had inspired others. Sasha's journey wasn't just about her, it had touched the hearts of those she had advocated for and empowered. The journey of redemption, of healing, was not a solitary path. It was a shared journey, one that could bring people together in ways they never expected. And as they walked away from each other that day, both Sasha and Tom knew that they had been part of something far greater than themselves, a story of change, of forgiveness, and of hope.